What if the way to heal narcissism is to love yourself more? I know that sounds almost ridiculous because the stereotype is just the opposite. It's narcissists love themselves too much, they're arrogant, self absorbed, overly confident. So, why would the solution be more self love? But here's what I've learned from the inside: narcissistic patterns don't grow out of excessive self love, they grow out of not feeling safe enough to be fully yourself. And that's a very different problem. I'm Brad, and I talk about narcissistic patterns from the inside. This isn't about excusing harm, and it's not about turning narcissism into something harmless. It's about understanding the internal structure accurately. Because if we misunderstand the root of the pattern, we misunderstand how real change happens. When I was a kid, a friend and I ditched class one day. We got caught by the school, but this time the school didn't call our parents. They just got us in trouble at school, and we had to stay and do extra work after class. I was glad they didn't tell our parents because I didn't want to have to deal with that. The next day, my friend told me he had gone home and told his parents about it anyway. I remember the reaction I had. It was very confusing. I thought he was dumb. Why would you tell your parents something you don't have to? Why let them in your life at all? At that time, the reaction felt completely obvious to me. But looking back now, it reveals something important about the emotional environment I grew up in. My parents weren't cruel, they weren't abusive, but they also weren't deeply involved in my internal world. If something happened in my life, it usually wasn't explored very much. Maybe a brief reaction, maybe a moment of disappointment, but then it would fade away. There wasn't much curiosity about what I felt, and there wasn't much emotional engagement at all. And when you grow up in this kind of environment, you don't necessarily feel deprived, you normalize it. As a kid, I actually thought I preferred it. I thought I was independent. But what that environment quietly communicated to me was something deeper. It communicated that the real me, my inner experience, wasn't that important. It was not something that people were very interested in, not something worth bringing forward very often. And when a child receives this message enough times, they adapt, not consciously, but structurally. For me, the adaptation was creating a version of myself that didn't need anyone: calm, independent, self contained, someone who didn't want emotional support and didn't need emotional support. That became the identity I operated from. So when my friend told me he had voluntarily told his parents about ditching class, it honestly didn't make sense to me. Because in my world, exposing parts of your life that you didn't have to expose felt completely unnecessary. Why bring something forward that wouldn't be received as important anyway? Why risk exposure when distance feels safer? So instead of sharing more, I learned to distance, I learned to withhold. And over time, that distance stopped feeling like protection. It just felt like who I was. But those equations don't stay in childhood. They follow you into adulthood. They shape how close you let people get, how much of yourself you reveal, how safe it feels to be known. And it took me a long time to recognize something important. The independence I was proud of was actually distance. And the calm, self contained version of me that I thought was just my personality was a structure I had built to avoid exposing the parts of myself that never felt very important in the first place. That recognition didn't immediately change my behavior, but it did something more important. It helped me start seeing the pattern. And once you start seeing the pattern, you begin to recognize it everywhere that it shows up. Years later, with my oldest daughter, Gigi, that same structure showed up again. She would tell me I was absent, that she wanted more from me, more engagement, more emotional presence. And she wasn't casual about it. She was sad, sometimes angry, sometimes even tearful. And it happened more than once. She would say things like, "You saw me in the house the other day and you didn't even say hi. You never hug me. You say you'll try harder, but nothing changes." And sometimes it would get to the point where she would say she needed no contact with me for a while. That's heavy coming from your daughter. In those moments, I would sit very still, blank face, breathing shallow, my chest tight, my mind racing. This again? What does she want from me? I just suck at this. If I try harder, maybe this time it will work. What I felt in those moments wasn't pride or inflated ego. It was pressure, intense pressure. And my goal in those moments wasn't transformation, it was relief from that pressure. So I would try to do it right, be more attentive, say the right things, make more effort. But internally, it felt mechanical, like performance under pressure. And eventually, the pressure would fade, and I would drift back into distance again, because sustained closeness felt like exposure. If what I'm describing feels uncomfortable but familiar, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just quietly recognizable, take a second to like the video or subscribe. Not to agree with me necessarily, but to help keep conversations like this visible. For most of my life, I thought those moments just meant I was bad at relationships, that I lacked discipline, or that I just needed to try harder. But once I began recognizing the pattern, something different started happening. I would occasionally catch it, right there in the moment, chest tight, mind racing, trying to figure out what to say, trying to relieve the pressure, and a small part of me would notice something. Oh, this is the pattern. It's not proof that I didn't care, not proof that I was incapable of love, just the same protective structure I had learned a long time ago, still running. And once you start noticing the pattern, you begin to see it everywhere. This is where the idea of loving yourself more starts to make sense. Not loving yourself in the sense of thinking you're amazing, not affirmations, not inflated confidence. What I mean is loving yourself enough to be authentically you, even if that version isn't perfect, even if someone might reject it, even if it disappoints someone. For someone with narcissistic patterns, that's terrifying because authenticity feels like exposure, and exposure has always felt unsafe. So instead of being authentic, we manage perception, we manage closeness, we manage how we appear. Sometimes that management looks like confidence, sometimes it looks like superiority, but internally it's armor, not love. If exploring this kind of internal work feels unfamiliar or difficult, you're not alone. That's exactly why I created the free online Awake Narcissist community. It's a space where people explore these patterns slowly, without shame, and without the pressure to perform growth. If you want that kind of support, the link is below. Real change doesn't start with forcing yourself to become someone different, and it doesn't start with tearing yourself down. It starts with noticing. Noticing the chest tightening, noticing the blank face, noticing the urge to relieve pressure instead of staying present, and sometimes quietly saying to yourself, oh, this is that pattern. Not judging it, not collapsing into shame, just seeing it clearly with eyes wide open. Because once you start seeing the pattern, another question slowly starts to appear. Am I willing to be real here? Not perform, not manage, just be real. And that's where loving yourself becomes important in a way that maybe isn't obvious. Because loving yourself doesn't mean thinking you're amazing. It means believing the real you is worth showing, even when it's imperfect, even when it's uncomfortable, even when you're not sure how the other person will respond. For someone with narcissistic patterns, that's terrifying because authenticity feels exposed, and exposure has always felt unsafe. So, loving yourself in the way that actually heals this pattern means something very specific. It means loving yourself enough to risk being real, enough to say things like, I don't know how to do this, or I feel pressure right now, or I'm afraid I'm falling here, or failing here. It means loving yourself enough to stop performing a version of yourself that feels acceptable and instead show up as the person you actually are, even if that person is awkward, even if that person is uncertain, even if that person is still learning. Because authenticity only becomes possible when you believe the real you is worth being seen. Narcissism doesn't grow out of loving yourself too much. It grows out of never feeling safe being fully yourself. Healing isn't about humiliation, and it isn't ego inflation. It's learning to love yourself enough to stop performing, enough to risk authenticity, enough to stay present even when exposure feels uncomfortable. This doesn't excuse the harm, but it does open the door to real change. If you want to explore this work slowly and honestly, join the free online Awake Narcissist community below. And if you want more context for this journey, grab my free ebook, 10 Confessions from a Self-Aware Narcissist. Thanks for being here. See you next time.